I want to talk about three other little words. Do your best. Do your best. Just a simple three little words, but they can be expressed in very different ways. Picture, for example, a parent that is dropping off their kid to their game. Pick whatever sport, fill in the blank there you want to. But as they're dropping their kid off, maybe it's just been hard, it's been a long week, or their child is tired or whatever. And so kind of one final word of encouragement as their kid is getting out the car, the parent turns around and says, you know what, just go out there, just do your best. Right? So what does that mean? Just, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Just do what you can do, do your best. Well, that same kid in that same game during halftime, when the team is losing very badly, the coach pulls the whole team together. And he gives them an impassioned speech. He has seen that they've been lazy, they haven't been really executing their fundamentals, and so he gives them a good talking to. And the last thing that he says to his team before they break that huddle is he says, hey, now go out there and do your best. Same three words, very different way of saying that. As we close out Paul's letter to Titus, a letter that was written some 2,000 years ago, we see that 2 times Paul uses this phrase, do your best. So what is it that Paul told Titus to do his best at? Well, let's find out that answer together. So if you have your Bible, turn with me, Titus. Toward the back of the Bible, Titus chapter 3. We're going to wrap up our study of this book of the Bible tonight by looking at verses 12 through 15. So here's what Paul writes in his conclusion of his letter. When I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, do your best to come to me at Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there. Do your best to speed Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their way. See that they lack nothing. And let our people learn to devote themselves to good works, so as to help cases of urgent need and not be unfruitful. All who are with me send greetings to you. Greet those who love us in the faith. Grace be with you all. 2 times, Paul said, do your best. These instructions in the close of his letter were very tangible. They were very real for Titus. But as you and I said here today, we should not head to Nicopolis to go and see Paul because he's not going to be there. He has not been there for quite some time. We cannot do our best to speed Zenas, the lawyer, and Apollos on their way. They too have been gone for quite some time. So these instructions were very tangible and literal for Titus, but how does that help us today? Well, fortunately, Paul also broadened out, even back then, he broadened out to a wider audience. Look again at verse 14. He said, and let our people. Well, who's our people? Well, Paul, as one believer, as one follower of Jesus, is writing to Titus, another believer, follower of Jesus. So our people are believers everywhere, which includes the believers here in this room tonight. So we're included in this instruction in verse 14. And what is it? Let our people learn to devote themselves to good works, so as to help cases of urgent need and not be unfruitful. Every week, we encounter people with needs. What are we supposed to do about it? Here's the aim, here's the charge, here's the application to us from this passage, is to do our best, do your best to erase others' needs. Do your best to erase others' needs. You might be thinking, well, Josh, I don't see the word erase in here. Where are you getting that from? Well, at the end of the verse 13, we see that phrase, see that they lack nothing. Titus was told to speed Zenas and Apollos on their way, see that they lack nothing. That's where we get the concept of erase. If you had a friend who was traveling and they were going to be in this area for a week, and they reach out to you and they say, hey, can I stay with you? And you're like, yeah, sure. And so they show up, they're going to be in the area for a week, and you greet them on the first night. You invite them in and you say, yeah, great, really looking forward to having you here for the next 3 nights. And your friend's like, wait, what? You're like, oh yeah, you can only stay here for 3 nights. The rest of the time, I don't know, you're going to have to figure it out on your own. You didn't really address their need. You kind of did. It's kind of helpful, but it's also kind of not, because they base their plans on you erasing their need for a place to stay. So to see that someone lacks nothing, to go all the way in someone's need, is to erase their need. That's where we're getting that concept from. Want to examine that phrase. Want to examine this charge through the framework of 4 questions. Here's the 4 questions we want to answer tonight. First of all, whose needs? Do your best to erase others' needs. Well, whose needs, number 1. Number 2, what's our motivation to do that? Third, what happens if we don't? What happens if we don't do our best to erase others' needs? And then finally, the 4th question we'll look at is, what does that look like? What does it look like to erase others' needs? So we're going to look at each one of those. Let's start with number 1. So first of all, whose needs? Do your best to erase others' needs. Whose needs? Well, obviously anyone who has a need. But if you notice, in this passage, the first application, the primary audience, is for fellow believers. Might be thinking, well, really? Doesn't that seem kind of inward focused? Aren't we supposed to be like solving world hunger? Why the first priority, the first people that we look to meet their needs are other believers? I wrestled with that this week. Because as I was studying this passage, thought, yeah, okay, so other people out there, people that don't know Jesus yet. And that is certainly true. We should consider their needs. But first believers, why? Well, if you remember back to last week and the prior verses, as we'll unpack those for us last week, the most important thing that we can do is to be and is to make disciples of Jesus. The most important task that we have if we have been saved by the Lord and we are growing and being a disciple ourselves is to make other disciples. Only Christians can do that. Only believers can do that. And that task is so important and it's so exclusive that if believers are distracted by urgent needs, we will be less able to do the most important thing that we have to do. It is going to be harder for us to be a disciple of Jesus and to make disciples of Jesus if we ourselves are distracted by other needs. And so whose needs do we look to? First, we actually look to the needs of those in this room. We look to the needs of those who are other believers with us so that we can focus on that most important thing. I have a tangible illustration of that from my own life, or at least what could have been. So a few weeks ago, as most of you know, Heather and I, Will and Victoria, we were all out in Boston for a very intensive, is very encouraging, very rewarding, but a very intensive assessment process. We had to be back at the building on 8 o'clock sharp Friday morning, where we're going to go right into an interview right away. And so in the morning, as we're all trying to get ready, 5 people sharing one bathroom, Uber's waiting outside, hurrying up, going. I get a text on my phone from my parents who are watching our kids, and they said, there's no heat or hot water in the house. I'm 3 hours away. There's nothing I can do, but I have to help them try to problem solve. And so in the midst of trying to get ready and trying to hurry up to get to the Uber, to get to the place so I can go through this very intensive process that's going to require all of my mental and spiritual and emotional energy, I'm trying to figure out how to solve a problem 3 hours away. By God's grace, a few phone calls, I was eventually able to figure it out. But the reason I'm sharing that illustration is because last week, a brother here, someone who's in this room, said, hey, if that ever happens, give me a call and I will go over there and I will take care of it for you. That's the illustration of this passage. That we look to erase others' needs, whatever that need might be, so that one another, that we can be less distracted from responding and obeying what the Lord has called us to be doing. That's the picture. One reason that God surrounds us with a spiritual family is so that we don't have to go it alone. Titus wasn't alone. We saw that in verse 13. It's implied in this instruction for Titus to send Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their way. It implies that Zenas and Apollos had been with him. He was not alone. Not only was he not alone, Paul wanted to make sure that he didn't stay alone. In verse 12, Paul said, I'm going to send either Artemas or Tychicus to you. I'm going to relieve you, going to give you help. By making those travel arrangements, by passing along the greetings, as we saw in verse 15, Paul was reminding Titus that he was not alone, that he was part of a larger family, a larger community of believers. And that same thing is true for us today. What's our motivation? Our second question. What's our motivation to do our best to erase others' needs? Because we're family now. We're family. Just as God raised Jesus from the dead, So to anyone who has trusted in Jesus for his rescue has been raised up into an eternal family that we don't deserve to be a part of, but we have been united by Jesus. He has brought us together, made us part of a spiritual family that is bigger than ourselves. And that's the only place, it's the only family where we can truly experience the type of love that we saw in verse 15. Verse 15, that middle sentence, it said, greet those who love us in the faith. That type of love is a phileo love, a brotherly love. Brothers and sisters, our family now. As I think about my own family, as I think about my kids, I don't love my kids because I have to. I love my kids because they're my blood, literally. As I look around this room, I see brothers and sisters that we've been united by blood, by Jesus' blood. And so I love you, not because I have to, but because we're family, because we get to go on this journey together. We've been raised up into a spiritual family that's so much bigger than our physical relational family, united by Jesus' blood. And so our motivation to seek to erase each other's needs is because God has united us together. We respond to him. Third question. What happens if we don't? What happens if we don't do our best to erase others' needs? It's a fair question, because honestly, it would be a whole lot easier to ignore this passage and to ignore other passages in the Bible like this that call us to look more to others than to ourselves. But as we've been studying through this book of Titus, we've talked a few times about how Titus was on the island of Crete, and one of the problems about people on the island of Crete at that point in time was that the Christians who were there looked no different from the other people around them. There's nothing about them that was remarkable. There's nothing about them that was attractive that would make someone want to know this Jesus that they followed, and they needed to stand out. Well, friends, you and I today, we're in our own version of Crete. What happens if we don't do our best to erase others' needs is that we communicate something unintentionally, perhaps, but we communicate something about Jesus, that he's not really all that radically different, that he's not sufficient. What happens if we don't do it? We miss an opportunity to show to the world, to the people that we know, by how we care for one another, by how we genuinely seek to make a difference in one another's lives. We would miss an opportunity to show how much Jesus changes us. We can't miss that opportunity. Growing up, I honestly would not have seen myself as very selfish. I just didn't really see myself that way. And then I got married. And then I had another person who I spent every waking moment or just about with. And I suddenly realized how selfish I had always been. Well, for those of you in the room that are married, you know that marriage completely fixes that. Makes you completely unselfish, totally fine. So Heather and I thought, or I won't throw her under the bus, I'll throw myself under the bus. I thought that I'd conquered that selfishness thing once and for all. And then we had kids. And then I realized I had a marathon of a way to go to still work on not being selfish. We all are more inward focused than we'd probably like to admit. That's just the reality. But confessing that, acknowledging that is the first step towards growing, and think about the impact that we can have when we live in ways that demonstrate a radical care, a radical love for one another. Think of what a testimony that would be to those who are watching us. Which is our fourth question that we want to answer. As we think about doing our best to erase others' needs, what does that look like? What does that look like? Well, in 2 words, one way to say that would be live generously. Ta-da. Live generously. This is not a Fireside shirt. This is a Thrivent Financial shirt. It's a Christian financial management organization. Very quick, not commercial, but very quick offer. On the back table as you leave, we have had a bunch of these shirts laying around for like 3 years because we were supposed to do a project for the community that got canceled because of COVID, and these shirts have just been sitting around. And so I want each and every one of you to be able to have the opportunity to get one of these shirts. It's first come, first serve. So, don't elbow each other because you're doing your best to erase others' needs. So go back, grab a shirt, and then find someone who would want it and give it to them and say, here you go. Maybe they'll do the same. But they're super soft. They're super comfortable. But I hope that every time you wear it, if you do take one, reminds you of this concept, reminds you of this passage, to live generously. How do we live generously? When we think about others' needs, what kind of needs? Probably what first comes to mind is financial, and that's certainly relevant. But there's also other needs that we have and that others have. There's financial, there's relational, there's spiritual, there's practical. So how can we live generously? Let's live generously with our money. Here's one idea. There's a million ideas, but here's one. I encourage you to consider setting aside a little bit of money on a monthly basis or every time you get your paycheck, however you navigate your finances. Set aside a little bit of money and put it in a fund. Set it aside, put an envelope or a different account at the bank, whatever, and label it for others. And let it build up, trusting that God will give you a moment to use it. Maybe it sits there for 6 weeks, maybe it sits there for 6 months, but I guarantee you that there will be some moment that if you're doing that out of responsiveness to all that God has blessed you with, I guarantee you that there will be some moment where you're talking with a friend, you're talking with someone here, and they share a tangible financial need. They have some type of debt, and they say, yeah, I really need $322. And you have $322 in that fund. And what a blessing it'll be to say, wow, look at what God did, that he prepared me to be able to help this other person. That's one way that we can live generously with our money, set some money aside and expect to be given moments to use it. Relationally, how do we live generously with our time? Take a moment now, take a moment later, write down the names of 1, 2, 3 people who you know, who you interact with, who you sense, especially at this time of year, especially in the season that can be filled with such joy, but also such heartache, that might benefit from your time. Might be feeling a little lonely, might be feeling a little discouraged, depressed. Who might be 1, 2, 3 people in your life? And then will you reach out to them this week? Maybe set up a time to meet, maybe have them over, maybe it's just a phone call, but in some way, we can live generously with our time by devoting some of our time to reach out to someone who the Lord might have positioned you to contact, to encourage them. Let's live generously with our hope. Live generously with our hope. Same kind of application. Think of the people in your life who don't know Jesus yet, who don't know that hope that only comes from having a relationship with him. Let's be generous with that. Especially at this time of year, the greatest gift that we could give anyone is to be able to point them to the gospel, to the good news of what Jesus has done for us. To give us hope, not just for eternity, but also for this life. Think of the people in your life who don't know that, who don't have that hope yet. And will you commit to praying for them by name every single day? Trusting that the Lord will give you, or maybe someone else, a moment to be able to share that hope with them. That's how we can live generously with our hope. Lastly, live generously with our hands. Kind of similar to the financial application, a way that we can live generously with our hands is to look at your weekly schedule, your monthly schedule, and set aside a few hours. Maybe it's a Saturday afternoon, maybe it's a weeknight, whenever it is, but just block out some time for the what if. And let that what if be for the person that winds up having a need. Maybe they need to move something. Maybe there's a project. Who knows what it is? God knows what it is. But if you're anything like me, my week can get completely full. And then when a need pops up, I'm like, wow, I really care deeply about that. I care for this person. I just don't have time. But if I'm carving out some time and just leaving it open, then hopefully when that need arises, I'll be better positioned to be able to jump in and help. It's one way that we can live generously with our time, with our hands. Maybe as you're sitting here tonight, maybe you're the one right now who has an urgent need. Whether that's financial, whether it's relational, whether it's spiritual, whether it's practical. Maybe you're hearing this, you're thinking, wow, I see that. I see the call that's in this passage. I hear these applications. I think they're good. I just can't devote enough time enough resources right now. I'm just not in that place. I want to encourage you, don't beat yourself up. Because of Jesus, do your best. And other times, when we're too inward focused, when we realize that we've been spending too much time, too much resources, too much energy on just ourselves, verse 14, let's learn, practice to devote ourselves to good works so as to help cases of urgent need and not be unfruitful. Friends, we're called to bear fruit for God's glory. And one of the ways that we can do that is to address urgent needs. That word urgent is important because there's a million needs, and not all of them are urgent. But when we see financial, relational, spiritual, practical needs that are inhibiting someone's ability to go and make disciples, God has probably positioned us to be aware of that need in that person's life so that we are the ones who can jump in, that we are the ones who can intervene. Because of Jesus, do your best. That's what we're called to do. You pray with me.